Not, I'll just start with the developer exception page. We already know exceptions, right? You and I have a pretty fair idea. We all are into development and we all have a pretty fair idea of what exceptions are and how do we work with it. Do you all remember the startup class? We have a configure method in this is pretty much already covered by, I think, in the last class by Samantha about the configure method and everything. So here you see your use file server. I want to specifically talk about this use file server, and you see here one thing as use developer exception page. Does anyone here has an idea of the use developer exception page? First, let me ask this. Anyone has an idea of use developer exception page?
Is it something regarding like we can configure like how and when the system should throw the exception and in the way the exception should be thrown like
No, actually, the use developer exception page is when I am as a developer working, I want to whenever an exception is thrown, I don't want a user friendly message. I don't want sorry we ran into some trouble. I want to see the stack trace that where at which line did the exception came, what happened, what went wrong, what are the cookies and what were every other thing. So this developer exception page basically helps me get that. But if I have a use file server, what this use file server does, let's go this. Use file server middleware combines the functionality of use default files and use static files middleware. So what happens whenever you say, like, I just run an application directly, what happens? It directly runs the default file in my root server, that is my www root folder, right? So this, if I say run hit, I just ran my application, the local host, what it will do, use file server will take it to the default pages. So if in this line, I have added here in app.run exception, throw new exception, it won't show me this exception because the use file server has already taken me to the default page. So basically this particular line of code did not execute. But in case, let's say I write a page which did not exist in my code, or I comment this app.use file server line, and then I execute this page, I will be shown with this developer exception page. And what does this developer exception page has? It has contains exception details like stack trace, including the file name and line number that the cause, query string, and etc. And the good part is we can modify the developer exception page also. If I want to see, let's say I got a exception at line number 15. By default, it will show me maybe let's say 20 lines of the code and it will just highlight the 15th line. But I don't want that much of detail. I just want it to show 10 lines of code on the exception page. So source code line count I can define how much line of code of the source I want on my page and other such criteria. So here we can create this developer exception page and we can add this app.developer exception page. So this source code line count property specifies how many lines of code to include before and after the line of code that caused the exception. So this can be a very helpful property when you do not want to show a lot of data on your exception pages. You just want one line, or if you want a lot of data so that you can find exactly where your problem was, so to help you stack trace. But and if you see here, we have added if environment is development, then only show the use app developer app exception page. Else do not show, because of course we do not want that in any other environment and exception environment. If let's say there come an exception, there was a scenario which went wrong and the application threw an exception. I don't want my production people, my live users to see the source code. For them, I want to show a user-friendly message that, hey, something went wrong, right? So it's very important here that we control it in based upon the hosting environment. What again, very important thing is if I take this piece of line of code and I put it up here, and in this case, even when my this app.use file server is commented, if I run the application, I will not see the developer exception page. Instead, it will just show me an exception message directly. Why? Because this whole application was after the run phase. So it's very important for us that we should always add this developer exception page as early as in the stack issue. So middleware must be plugged into the request processing pipeline as early as possible so that it can happen. If we add it afterwards, this won't work. So it should be always, if not the first, in the beginning of your source code, after second, two, three lines, whatever. But it should always, we should try to add this portion in the beginning of our configure code. So this is more about the developer exception page. There is not much detail. Let me try to show you the code. Are you guys able to see my code screen, Visual Studio?
Not yet.
No. Okay. I think I shared a single screen. Let me check. Now it will be visible, right?
Yeah.
So here you see in the configure environment, we have already added in the beginning that if it is use the developer exception page. I request everyone to please mute themselves. There's a lot of disturbance. Yes, thank you so much. Here, if I add here use dot one portion in our the one we had in the code, see this is the portion. If I remove this portion, we won't be able to see an exception page. So let's just comment this file code. What's the code up here? Sorry. Let's just for now comment this code and add our piece of code. Okay, let's just run this. Yes, Thomas. Actually, I copy pasted there, so it added some more content to it. So I had to remove them. I'm sorry, my system is incredibly slow today. Anyways, meanwhile, this application starts, which is going taking forever to start. Let's talk about this thing. So uh, the major highlight points here were that the use file server middleware, it is actually taking you to the default files and static files. So it might not show you the exception page because it will take you directly to the www root folder. Second main point was the developer exception page has the stack trace and query string, etc. details. We can customize this whole middleware. And next is it should always come on the top in the beginning of your code as early as possible so that that could actually help you out. I should have restarted my system because it's really, really slow right now. Meanwhile, anyone has any question, we can. Yes, see, this is our page. So this is the developer exception page. Here you can see there is the area where we had the through exception area. Then we have the query. If let's suppose I would have added here page ABC and I would have added a query string A is equal to 10. We had and B equal to 20. So I would have the query string values over here that what we passed into the query string, if there are any quickies and everything. So you can see the details here. So this actually helps very much into the when you are trying to code and you want to find out what exactly the error is. But we do not want our production people, our staging or the QA people to see this page. There we want them to show a friendly message. That's why this is more as developer exception page. So this is a very good functionality available here, very helpful for the, I would say, developers. Let's move forward to the next topic, that is .NET Core environment variables. I have been right now from past 5 months talking about environment, development environment, production, staging that they should not see. How do we handle this? This is handled by the environment variables. There are three majorly development environments available. First is the development environment, second is the staging environment, and third is the production environment. The difference between these environments is the development environment. I want to show the full details. So this I have already told you that we want to see the unhandled exceptions. I do not want to see minified JavaScript or CSS. We want the non-minified one so that it can be loaded and I can debug into my JavaScript file also. I can modify my CSS easily and check how it's looking. But in the staging environment, we don't want that. We want that it should have the minified versions of JavaScript and CSS. There should not be any developer exception page. Instead, they should see a user-friendly this. What is a staging environment? A staging environment is generally a duplicate, I would say a copy of the production, which has as exact server identical details like the actual production environment. The all the services, like if there is some integration, etc. We would like that in our staging environment, we also communicate directly with those our integrations and we can test this. Staging environments are very critical in any organization so that we make sure that nothing fails. Sometimes everything works properly in development, everything works properly in QA, but dev and QA might not have the same configuration as production. And when you deploy the same code into the production, a lot of things goes wrong. So staging environment is a way to prevent that. We first deploy our code into an environment which is a replica of the production, and we make sure that everything is as good as to go to production. And finally is the production environment, which is generally seen by the end user. Again, we want a minified JavaScript and CSS file there. The user-friendly page should be there instead of developer exception page. And how this environment is set, this is done by a environment variable, that is ASP.NET Core environment. On development machines, we set this in launch settings.json file. We can also set it into the environment variable of our system. In staging and production server, it is usually set in the operating system itself. Before moving to the third point, I'll say if let's suppose you have an ASP.NET Core environment variable set in your operating system also, that is in your computer directly, and in your launch settings files also, then the launch settings.json will override the operating system value. So always your environment variable as defined in your launch settings.json file will be taken as priority. And how do we access this runtime environment? You saw this iWebhost environment was there. We have this same thing here, that we could use this same thing, this iHosting environment service, which actually access the runtime environment. And here we checked that whether our environment is development. So we do have certain things, that is development, is staging, is production, this type of areas which can define whether we are in the which environment. If there is no environment set explicitly, then it is by defaulted to production. And that makes very much sense. Let's suppose you do not have anything into the production and you don't want that your in your production, when there is no setting available, it starts behaving as a development. So to be very careful, we have they have done the default setup as the production. Also, let's suppose there are going to be a QA, UAT, and other environments, demo environments. Then you are very much free that we can create custom environments and they are supported. And how will you uh, check whether it's a QA or UAT environment or not? You will be checking it by this, that is environment variable, because these are the by default ones. And here is the one you can check. Just give me a minute, I'll be back in a moment. Sorry for that. So here we have the is environment variable. So I have a very small code snippet to check, like if environment is to development, use this. Else, I've added if environment is staging, production, or UAT, then just use an exception handler. I've created a custom page of error, so you should use this. So this is the way where you can define your environments and work accordingly to them. Any questions so far? Okay, let's move forward. MVC. This must be a very common term to everyone. If you have not worked on MVC before, it's a design pattern. You must have surely have heard of it. Right nowadays, everyone mostly works on MVC, and it stands for Model View Controller. Before talking about this whole page, let's just look at this view. What is Model View Controller? View is very much clear from the name itself that it is the one which is visible on the screen. So view is the one which renders the content to the user. Controller is the logic behind this. Controller is basically, you can think of it as an engine. Whenever you request, I want to go from page A to page B. So controller is the one which decides and asks see, oh, the user have asked me to put from A to B, and has takes the logical decision to move you to the next view. So controller is the brain, is the engine which works and combines all of it. And model is basically the business logic. That is the one which connects to your database. It has all of the connection that, oh, save this thing, get this thing, all the CRUD operation or any other logic you put, that is into the model. So when a request arrives at our server, you know websites how they work, request and response. Whenever a request arrives at our server, it is in the controller in the MVC that receives the request. So your controller, as I told you, is the engine. It acts between like a bridge, that where which data should go, where the user should navigate, how to navigate, what to show. Do I need to show a pop-up? Do I need to show them an error page? Or whether to hide some data, whether to show some data? All these things, whenever a request arrives, how to process that request, the decision is taken by the controller. Controller creates the model. The model has the classes that describe the data. So now let's say I say login. Once I log in, the controller decide, okay, the user has logged in. Now create the dashboard page. So it will go and create the class of the dashboard. It will fetch the dashboard details for you to show your front home page, the dashboard page. In addition to data itself, model also contains the logic to retrieve data. So model is not just the classes, it is also your stored procedures, your logic of fetching the data, all your CRUD operation, that is also into the model. Now, taking that model, it takes the data, it takes the model, but how to present it, whether your dashboard has a graph or a chart or a grid view or a table or a menu, how that should, the whole look of that, that is the view. So view mostly has a lot of HTML part. View is the area where you add your JavaScript, your CSS part, so that it looks beautiful. So it is the view that generates the required HTML to present the model data. That is the employee data provided to it by the controller or any other data. The HTML is then sent over the network to the user who made the request. So now the HTML is basically your response that goes back in uh, as per the request made. So this is a very short life cycle of I would can we can say is of what MVC is. I hope I'm not going too fast.
That's good.
Okay. Okay. The application that I earlier joined, this actually I added was an MVC application. I have just created it and done nothing into it. I have not done any changes apart from the one I just made to the configure application. So I just added an employee management MVC type application. Let me just show you also that how you can do that if someone is not available. Aware. When we add the ASP.NET Core web application, it shows you certain templates that whether you want to add a web application, whether you want to do an MVC, whether it's a web API. So I just chose the MVC one.
Priyanka, can you just zoom that code? Uh,
Okay, sure. Though nothing is added to the code right now. Let me
means
just zoom.
if you're making a changes, just
Sure,
keep
sure,
it.
sure, sure, sure.
Sure. Thank you.
Is it better?
That's good.
Okay. So I just wanted to show you the structure majorly right now. We already know the www root folder. You can see here that we have our CSS, JS, and library folders. This is the controller. It has, see down here what we were talking about, model, view, and controller. So there is a model edit for us, error view model. It is nothing but a class. So in this class, if you can see, there is just two things where the request ID, there is a getter and setter, and there is a bool variable show request ID, which is again set based upon some ID. Like if there is a request ID, show it. So this is just a basic example of what a model should look like. It is generally a class which is then going to be talking to your data, what I would say is your database. Now, how will you add your database into the code is of course when you talk in the real applications. I'm not talking about this tutorials. When we actually work in the applications, generally, are you guys familiar with entity framework? either you
Yeah.
connect Either you connect your database, you connect through entity framework. There are two ways, whether code first or database first. I am more usually comfortable with the database first. So you already have this error database into your sorry, table into your table where you will be logging all your errors and everything. Or let's say I want to add an employee only, so I'll be adding a new model here. Let's say, sorry, I'll be adding a model named employee, which is going to basically have my uh, employee details. So what attributes an employee is going to have? He's going to have an employee ID. He's going to have so let's say I say he is going to have an employee ID. Now I'm setting a getter and setter for this that we can fetch this. We can set this employee ID as well. He is going to have a name and various other things, right? So we, as defined in my table, we can secure what we want to have the details. And as per my database table, we can, of course, have these values set. So this Finally, when I say my stored procedure, I'll add into the entity framework. My stored procedure is going to have a result file. And using AutoMapper, I can connect this employee model to my result file of the get employees, let's say, stored procedure. And this is how this works in the real way. So I'm maybe talking a step forward, but I'm exactly trying to give you a picture how this employee class is going to be used. This employee class will be auto mapped with my stored procedure, which is going to fetch my employee details. Or I have a stored procedure, insert employee details, add employee details. So it is going to take this all these fields. So how am I going to store? I'm going to store my employee request in this in the object of employee class, and then I'm going to pass it to my stored procedure so that these details can be moved to my database and I can save. So this is the place this class is going to act as the major thing which is going to uh, uh, from where I can fetch data from database, or I can send data to the database. I hope I'm clear.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So whenever we add an MVC application in our startup file, that you see the it added use static files, use routing and other things, right? He used HTTPS redirection and everything. This portion which we commented before. Let me uncomment this now and comment what we wrote. Here, when we use an application file, we add one thing, that is app dot, sorry, app dot use MVC with default root. And we need to very much make sure that we have your use static files before we have this use MVC with default root. Is this already being used? Why? Because if let's suppose, see, we have a static file. Let's say that there's a request, and that is for a static file. Let's say image. I want to show an image on my login page. That is my logo, and that is in and that image file is in this www root folder. That is where my static files used to take place. So if I use this use static files after this, it won't be displayed on it because I would already have been routed to my default route. So my on my index page or whatever page this my MVC route should take me, we will already be have gone to that page and we won't be able to take this. Everyone, please give me a minute. I'm so sorry for this again. Okay. So, so this is the area where we are going to define whether you have to use static files. So it should always. So one thing just to make sure is our use static file should always be before use MVC with default route. So if the another, let's say I just told you that if the user requested an image file which is in our root our static root folder, www root folder, and we had add this use MVC before that won't be loaded. Let's again say we now requested an MVC request. I just said let me take from index page to a reports page. Okay. So this use static middleware will pass the request to this, which will handle the request. So that won't have a problem. It will first go to the static file. It will say no, the request is not for a static file, and then it will move to the default route. But the other way around, it does not happen. It does not go from default to static, but from static to default, it does move. So this is a point to be that we should always take a note of while configuring the MVC application. With there is also one more application middleware which can be used, that is use MVC. Let's just come with this now. What is the difference between these two? Anyone who has an idea of these two?
Will it be common for all the environments, uh, like in a global way?
No.
Okay.
Something to do with the routing, that we have to specify which route goes to which
Yes.
module or controller.
Yes, it's more in the same way that use MVC. If we just read about, let's just say, using MVC, it just adds that the MVC will be there in the application file, but with the default route, you define whether what should be your default route, whatever you have set up in the startup CS. That my first page, this default page is going to be my default.aspx, or I say my default page is going to be index, or let's I say my default page should be login. So whatever you have routed in your map controller route, it will directly work with the default route. So this is majorly difference, but currently the more commonly used is use MVC with default route. Okay. One more thing. Generally here when we configure services, you see, we add services dot add MVC. So this is also done to so that we can include the MVC services dependency injected in our application. So any dependency that we have for an MVC file, we can use this. And we also have another one here, like add MVC core. And what is the difference between them is also very important difference, and I'll show you this difference. Add MVC versus add MVC core. Add MVC core only adds the core MVC services, whereas add MVC methods adds all the required MVC services. Also, if you add the add MVC, it indirectly internally, calls most better practice is to use the add MVC because it already handles the work of add MVC core. And how, let's say you did not use add MVC and used add MVC core, what will be the issue? Uh, my application, my view returned a HTML file, and maybe add MVC core works perfectly fine. But my view right now is returning a JSON data. And for that, I need to have a JSON formatter services registered with a dependency injection container so that my JSON data could be formatted well. But our add MVC core method does not have this JSON formatted data to register. So it will fail. We will get an error over there. So in order for this to work, we should have added our add MVC into the services when we configure it. So this is a very basic difference between add MVC and add MVC core. Generally, people think that we are doing a .NET Core application and we are working on MVC core, so we should add MVC core. But no, add MVC core is just going to call only certain type of MVC services and not your all services, and then you will have to add those services along later. So it's better practice to use add MVC. This is a very common mistake that people do, just thinking that it would have something to do with .NET Core, and as we are practicing core, we should go with MVC core. But that's not the ideal approach over here. Next is basically model, what I already talked about. That was our last topic for today, and that is adding models. And also I already told you that we can do what we do. We models are nothing but just how you create a class and how you add those data into the class and then reference it. Let's quickly have a look at view. So if you've seen the view also, you have home, shared, and other things. I have different views. And let's say the index.cshtml, what does it shows us? Now, if in this page I have to use any view, I can here use @model, and my model name was employee, right? And now if I want to use, let's say I want to show anything, I want to show h1, I want to use, so I will say @model dot. Am I making a mistake? Just a minute. Why is it not coming?
I think it should be model with a capital M. Can you try that?
Okay, and then employee, right?
Do you need namespace?
Maybe haven't done public or something like that. No, it is public. Mhm.
It's plural.
Okay, it should be model dot type only, sorry. What I'm doing wrong.
Is it capital M model?
No, it is generally small only. This should be small. Yes, see now it has added models. Employee. Check. Mhm. Wait, @HTML. Okay, maybe I'm doing something. HTML dot display name for. Yes. Actually, we were not taking the model first into this, and that's why. So here now I can use the employee and employee ID and everything over here. So this way we can now, like, I just want to print employee ID. So I can just print the employee ID here. So this is the way that you can use your model into your index file. So I want to add, in fact, a very interesting thing about views, I can also add conditions over here. So I can use if else also and else also. So if I say if at your model dot, sorry, uh, model dot employee, what happened to it again now? Yes. Sorry. Model dot employee ID is, let's say our first employee ID is 0. Let's say I have an employee ID with 0. Uh, it was an integer string. Sorry, so I'll have to do it like this. It is for super user. Let's say our 0 employee ID is for super user. This is giving error. Cannot convert lambda expression to type bool because it is not of a delegate type. Okay, I've done the lambda expression. That's why. So let's just say, see, so if I say that I want to perform some application for the super user only, for super user, I want to give an option to show, let's say, reports. And if the super user is not there, then I want to give them an option for something else, right? So I want to add an H1 with super user reports, and else I don't want to give them a super user. So in fact, here on the view, a lot of time we want to show and hide things based upon my model, based upon my data from the database, my client ID, my in employee, I can have employee ID, I can have department, I can show and use roles. So accordingly, we can have to hide and show data. So here you can use if else, you can use case when, you can use a lot of logical statements here, and for that you might need to use the values which are stored in your classes, that is in your models. So this way you can use those as well. So this was a basic of the topics today, a very intro of the MVC application. We talked about firstly developer exception page, then the environment variables and different types of development environments that we have. What is the difference between add MVC and add MVC a core, and what is the basic structure of an MVC application, what a model is, how you use a model into your view code. This was what we targeted for today. Now we have 10 minutes left for our session, so I just want to take questions now. Anyone is having any question, I'll be happy to take them. Let me stop my screen.
Hey, it's Thomas.
Yeah, hi Thomas.
Hey, what .NET template did you use for this?
I used MVC template.
Thank you.
So when we go, let me show you new project. I chose on ASP.NET Core web application. Next.
You're not
Let-
sharing your screen anymore.
Sorry, I forgot that. Can anyone confirm it's visible?
Yes.
So I just went to the new project area. I chose ASP.NET Core web application. Next. Here you can choose your project name, everything, solution name and all. Let me let it be web application 1. I have selected place solution project in the same directory. You can choose it different also. That's completely your choice. Create, save this. In the next window, you find different templates. Let's just do that. Here you can see empty API, web application, model view controller, Angular, lot of templates are here. So here you can choose which one you want to go with. You also have an option to choose whether you want to go with 2.1 or 3.1. Currently, we are working with the latest one, that is 3.1. If you see, when I took the MVC application, it by default created those folders for me, view, controller, model, added all those files for me. It had a sample index.html shared, home files, home controller, everything. So this application already adds a lot of data for you to start with. It basically creates the project structure for you. The web application one is basic, simple one where you do not follow the MVC architecture. API is a place where we want to create a full HTTP service. So basically, it is not going to have a user interface. APIs are generally used to get and fetch data. Like you are creating a mobile application, and for your mobile application to talk to your database, you have created an API, which is get fetching the data and providing it for your mobile application. So APIs are generally a service which does not have a user interface. The sole purpose is to help you in the backend to get the data. Empty is where you do not get all these things pre-added. You can start from the scratch. You can add each file on your own. You can choose whether you want to go with MVC or you want to go with simple. And Angular, another, is basically if you want to add and play around in your view. Let's say I want to go with MVC only, but I want to also include Angular into the project. So it will by default add the Angular dependencies and all of that. So these are various application available. I went with web application model view controller for our MVC project right now. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, that's good. So for entity framework, can you take a question about that?
Yeah, sure.
So you have a couple of options like code first, which you showed to us. You write the model, and then will that create the table for that model, or you have to create the table for that employee model yourself?
Okay. Yes. So there are two entity framework models. One is the code first approach. Second is the database first approach. Code first approach, you create your classes, and then based upon the class, database tables are gets created on their own. So that is one thing. That is the code first approach. Another is the database first approach, which is the more popular one, where you create your database structure, you add the tables into your database, your table, then you add the entity in your model, and based upon your tables, itself creates classes into your code. So as soon as you include the entity, you define, I want to add this table, I want to add this procedure, stored procedure. It will create those stored procedures. It will create those tables as classes into your code. When you add the stored procedure, based upon whether that stored procedure returns a data set or whether it does not return a data set, it is, let's say, an insert procedure, an update procedure, DML procedure. Accordingly, there are function imports. You can add a function import to it, and there you can it by default adds all the parameter and all the code that needs to be written. So a lot of file in that, there is a whole context.cs file that gets added, and there are a lot of things which gets added. I might be able to show you uh, a
Yeah, you can
sample code.
Yeah, if you can create that table for the employee using code first, is that possible?
Yes, give me a minute. I'll be able to show you. Let me stop my screen. I'll have to open the file and maybe I'll show you that. Thomas, can you see my screen now?
Yes.
See, this is an EDMX file that is basically the entity database file here. You will see based upon my entity, like this is one table, that is one borrower table, let's say. So, and these are all these properties that has been added is the columns of the borrower table. So this file gets created itself when there's a UI and the entity framework. Sorry, I cannot show you more of this because it's related to my work project. But there's a UI and there you can add the tables you want to select. You create this table and all this properties, you define their length, their data type and everything in the database. And it creates the file for you. and this is just an EDMX file. It also creates a .cs file for you for borrowers. It will create a .cs file for another table. So every table is added as an entity here. Hope that helps.
Yeah, that file is like a mapping two ways from
Yes. Yeah.
database to model and model to database.
Yes. So generally what happens, you have a class returned from your entity framework, be it in the form of a result data set from a procedure, or be it a class or an entity, and you have created your own model as well. It can work as a DTO, it can create as a business object, and you map those. There is an auto mapper functionality. In that auto mapper functionality basically maps both the items itself. The only thing is the name should be same, and then that way you can pass on data from here to there, so it will directly pass on. So this is the way you have to map your identities here, and how you create a bridge between your code and the database. Any other question for me?
What is the difference between Angular MVC and the one you just showed? Template.
Okay, Angular, I'm honestly very not sure, but see, as I remember, Angular is much more like in the HTML, you use Angular directives and everything. We will be taking Angular class and we will be learning more of it. But designing your whole view from the Angular perspective. This MVC is a framework. It is not a particular, it's a design pattern. It just is to differentiate your code into a way where you're separating business logic, the view presentation, and everything in the different format. Angular is again in how you enhance your view, how you add logic to it, how Angular is all used through TypeScript and also where you can add those things into the code. So I would say in the same MVC design pattern, maybe we can use Angular also, so that to enhance our views.
Yeah, I would say
JavaScript. Basically, that is the TypeScript here.
I'd say Angular MVC runs in the browser, and the one you just showed runs on the server.
But my view will run. That's the client side and server side script. In the view I created earlier, I can of course add a JavaScript also, right? There is a client. You might have seen clients. Might have known client side validations and server side validation. A very good example I'll say, when you do login, generally there are validations that you have to fill this data, or you change password. You say that your new password and your confirmed password should be same, right? So these are the validations generally at the client side. Server is not get hit for this, but whether you have entered your current password correctly or not, that has to come from the server, because your original password has been stored into the server, right? So that is server side validation. When we talk about a web application is client side and server side. Through Angular, through JavaScript, through all of these things, I can handle a lot of things on my client side. Whereas including this back thing, that the whole database and everything, it will hit my server, it will talk to the data, and it will convert the data. So even with the Angular application, we can have the server sides as well, so that it actually talks with the data.
Yeah, the Angular app talks with the server through an API. And the one you just showed doesn't have an API.
I just told API was a different thing. APIs are generally where we do not have. When I was explaining you the API thing, I told you that APIs are generally created where user does not have this. So let's say I create a project where it's an API which just talks with this whole database thing. It fetches me the employee details and everything. And I now create a web application, Angular application. And in that Angular application, instead of using this MVC structure, I am using that API. So these are ways of working your code. I have I'm putting an ERP system. In that ERP system, I won't be working everything through a web API. I will be using, let's say, otherwise hundreds of APIs in it. So depending upon your project structure, what is your project of what is the size of your project, what technologies you want to indulge. There are different ways how you can this. MVC is a design pattern. You can go with any other pattern. You can go with an interior pattern. There are a lot of design patterns. So just MVC is one of the patterns.
I think the ASP.NET, what we have just seen that you demoed is kind of like server rendered pages that shows to the website. Whereas Angular, we also use server to render the basic Angular, but the resulting is run on the client side. And yes, we do use the API to communicate with the server then. So I think there are some overlap, but yeah, ASP.NET is server rendered pages, especially when you put the tags in, which brings out the model information to the page.
Yeah. Good presentation. I would call the one we just seen like traditional MVC in the Microsoft framework world, and the Angular MVC would be modern.
Well, .NET Core is fairly modern. It's, I guess you can. It's up to developer preferences.
It's an old model, old modern.
You can say it as a different approach. You can say it as a different approach. There is an MVC with web forms also. So like this MVC, what we are doing is with core. This is MVC core. What the earlier that web forms one .NET framework. There also we have MVC pattern where that also. So MVC is as I said, is a design pattern. It's just a way of putting things. So it also has. Angular is a different technology. You can of course include into it. We cannot say that MVC is new or Angular is new or is better. It depends upon your requirement. Like in our initial first session, when we talked about whether to go with .NET Framework or go with .NET Core, we cannot say .NET Core is new, so it is better. There are things, there are requirements when we will prefer .NET Framework and not .NET Core. So of course, there are new and newer technologies coming every day, new frameworks, in fact, new versions are coming. But there are at times based upon our business requirements, and many other things, our server requirements, many other things, where an organization decides which technology they want to go forward to. So Angular is of course an approach, but we cannot say it's a better approach or it's a newer approach.
Right. It depends on the skills of the people in the team. What framework you should use, right?
Yes, with the skill also, it basically depends upon your requirement more or less. Because generally, if we talk about you are a single developer and you are doing a project, then of course it will come to our skills thing. But when it comes to team or when it comes to enterprise level projects, if there is a project which requires a certain kind of technology to work into, your client wants you to use that or something like that, you will hire people or you will train people for the skill the project requires. It's more depends upon the requirement of the project, the scale of the project, what you actually needs to build, which kind of web application it is, whether it is an ERP system or it is just a company website where it's going to be having more of static pages, or it is a website where there is a lot of user interaction, there is a lot of data that user needs to input. There's a lot of decision points based upon how the data is there, whether it's very much of the role based or it is very common, it will be just admin or simple user. Or I can have an application where are 10 types of different roles, and based upon different roles I have to show and hide features. So depending upon the type of application we are working into, we have to develop the technology, and every other factor then comes into place.
Thank you.
Most welcome. So I think we can wrap up our class now. If anyone do not have any other question, we are already past 5 minutes.
Yes, no.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Good to have you all. See you next week.
Thanks, Priyanka.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.